Dr. John Lennox is professor and fellow in mathematics and the philosophy of science at the University of Oxford in England. He is a world-renowned scientist and speaker and is the author of several best-selling books.
Scientists don't like discontinuity. And that's understandable because a discontinuity where the laws appear to break down can so easily lead to a gap situation. But the physicists are very happy to rest with the fact that there's a t equals 0, there's a time 0, there's a discontinuity at the beginning. Biologists don't have anything analogous so far as I can see, which may be the reason why origin of life theories succeed one another with the restless fertility of bewilderment. And that's a phrase very apt due to C.S. Lewis. You just have to look at Wikipedia or any book that lists the various origin of life scenarios. Darwin's warm little pond, a primeval soup, Miller-Urey's reducing atmosphere, monomer formation, monomer accumulation, Fox's experiments, Eigen's hypothesis, Hofmann's contributions, Wechterhäuser's hypothesis, ZN world theory, radioactive beach hypothesis, models to explain homochirality, self-organization, replication, deep-sea vent hypotheses, RNA world, metabolism first, iron-sulfur world, thermosynthesis world, bubbles, pumice rafts, autocatalysis, clay hypothesis, deep hot biosphere model, primitive extraterrestrial life, extraterrestrial organic molecules, Fredhoy's panspermia, lipid world, polyphosphates, PAH world hypothesis, multiple genesis, for a start. Now, I'm not going to go into all of those. I leave that to my expert colleagues. But there will no doubt be many more. It is a restless fertility of bewilderment. To explain how life began, we need to understand how its unique management of information came about. And so this is enormously important, because however life came to be, life involves a text. What it is at the very least a text in a 4-letter alphabet giving the longest word that we've ever discovered. And the analogy is true, of course, because it codes for something. It codes, as we heard yesterday, for the proteins. And it is what it is that seems to me point inexorably in the direction of an input of information and not to a purely naturalistic theory. The gulf between the non-living and the living is analogous, but it's much greater than the gulf between the raw materials of paper and ink and the finished product of paper with writing on it. Raw materials do not self-organize into linguistic structures like that of the DNA macromolecule. They are not emergent phenomena. I'll never forget the first time I went to a Dawkins lecture, he talked about emergence. And I asked him, give me an example of an emergent phenomenon. Oh, he said, the word processing capacity of a computer. I said, pardon? It's spectacular, isn't it? It emerged. We need to beware, and I'm tempted to give a little lecture on this. The word emergence covers a multiple of evils. Does it emerge without energy? Does it emerge with energy? Does it emerge with an input of a catalyst? Does it emerge with an influence of an enzyme? Does it emerge with an input of information? Oh, it emerged. The word is not good enough, ladies and gentlemen. And it conceals a lot of things, and it needs to be seriously unpacked. Manfred Eigen, who won the Nobel Prize again on origin of life things, says our task is to find an algorithm, a natural law that leads to the origin of information. But Paul Davies will contradict that. Physics, chemistry, mathematical laws of the type that are familiar to us from physics are not adequate to do the job for the simple reason that they cannot create information. Arthur Peacock once wrote, "In no way can the concept of information, the concept of conveying a message, be articulated in terms of the concepts of physics and chemistry." And Paul Davies again, "Can specific randomness be the guaranteed product of a deterministic mechanical law-like process like a primordial soup left to the mercy of familiar laws of physics and chemistry?" No, it couldn't. No known law could achieve this, a fact of the deepest significance. Now, there are deeper levels to which one can go, and some of them revolve around the work of the very brilliant mathematician and computer scientist Gregory Titan. And they're based on the concept of a Turing machine. That is a machine, an abstract mathematical concept that will simulate any computer. Now, if you're not interested in this, just go to sleep for a minute and I'll tell you when to wake up. And Titan's work makes very plausible the idea that no Turing machine can generate any information that does not either belong to its input or its own informational structure. Now just think about that for a minute. Because we are now familiar with the language of protein machines. Whatever else the cell is, it is a compendium of millions of machines, recognizably machines. And the cell, of course, is an information processor. So at the level of information processing, one would assume, if this is correct, that the cell can be, at that level, interpreted in terms of a Turing machine. But if no machine can produce any information that's not actually in it to start with, or an input from outside, that's the end of naturalism, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why I find, when I'm discussing these things, that people are very leery when they are naturalists of stepping into this area. A machine, let me repeat, does not create any new information, but it performs a valuable transformation of known information. And yet the claim persists that undirected natural processes created information. Now notice, this is not God of the gaps thinking. This is using theoretical computer science to point in a direction. The arguments are not completely conclusive, but they are pointing well away from the notion that natural processes can do it. And in the end, since we cannot repeat the origin of life, we are shut up to abduction. That is inference to the best explanation. And an inference to an explanation that makes sense and is plausible is infinitely better than one to an explanation that makes no sense whatsoever. Now, this all parallels a suggestion that Sir Peter Medawar, whom I mentioned yesterday, mentioned long ago, and he wondered whether there's a law of conservation of information that parallels the law of conservation of energy. I used to get wonderful 100-page papers saying, "Dear Professor Lennox, I have solved the problem of the perpetual motion machine. The following 100 pages will explain how to construct one." I threw it straight into the waste paper basket. Oh, but you say that's obscurantism. Why didn't you read it? How did you know he hadn't solved it? Because there's a deeper principle, the principle of conservation of energy. That is empirical, yes, but it's very well established. Now you see, people are wasting their time looking to construct a perpetual motion machine. If there is an analogy on the higher level, as Sir Peter Medawar and later Bill Dembski in many of his writings have suggested, if there is an analog, a law of conservation of information, then we're actually wasting our time looking for a purely naturalistic origin for life. Because life is a text, at least, that comes about and involves information processing. So if we take the cue from our experience with the perpetual motion machine and look at other types of higher order perpetual motion machines that approximate in this area, as Cooper's will tell you if you read his work, then it seems to me that very interesting things may well be discoverable. In our college, we have lovely dinners, and we have our guests placed, and we don't choose where they sit. So on a particular evening, I was sitting beside a world-renowned biochemist, and he asked me what I did, and I said, pure mathematics, and he said, how very boring. And he meant it. So I backtracked and I said, well, I'm interested in big questions as well. He said, like what? Well, I said, like the status of the universe. Is it created or... Oh, dear, he said, it's far worse than I thought. Listen. He said, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we're going to have a miserable evening, we've nothing to talk about. So I said, not at all, very fascinating. I said, I'm very interested in reductionism. I know at least 3 kinds. What kind are you? I said, I suspect you're a methodological reductionist, like I am, as a scientist. Split a big problem into little problems, solve the little problems, get insight on the big problem. Yes, he says, I do that. Well, I said, we can talk about that, can't we? So he's thawing out a bit. But I said, I suspect you're an ontological reductionist. He said, yes, everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. So it's coming back to the heart of what we're talking about. He says, yes, absolutely. That's my working principle. So I said, let's do a thought experiment. He said, here at the table? Yes, I said, why not? This is Oxford. And so I picked up the menu, and on it said, not very imaginatively, roast chicken, not even in French. And he said, what's the problem with this? And I said, well, look at this, R-O-A-S-T. That is meaning to you, because those marks are semiotic. They carry meaning. Now I said, you're a reductionist. He said, yes. Okay, I said, have a go at this. Explain to me the semiotics of those marks in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And there was silence, and his wife was beside him, and rather too loudly she said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. His response, I shall never forget, and I've had it from several. He said, it can't be done. He said, you know, John, he was getting friendly now, for 40 years I've gone into my laboratory thinking it could be done. And I was so stunned. I said, but physics and chemistry have only been going about 500 years. He said, it doesn't matter. You've got to have an input of intelligence. I nearly said, what, you mean the intelligence of the gaps? But I didn't. I was too kind to do that. And then it suddenly dawned on him that I wasn't clever enough to have thought of that. He said, where did you get that idea? I said, I admit it. I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. I always said, that's all right then. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, 40 years long, and yet the simplest inference from R-O-A-S-T. And we look down a magic stereoscopic microscope and we see DNA uncoiling. And we see 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. And we ask about that, and we're told chance and necessity. What? Perception. Perception. And it was Michael Polanyi, the brilliant chemist and philosopher, pointed out that there are hierarchies in things. If you take bricks, the material you use for the bricks will determine the stresses that they can take, but won't determine the shape of the buildings you can make out of them. The buildings you make out of them won't determine the shape of the town you construct around the buildings. There are levels, and they are not deducible one from the other bottom up. There is a top-down causation. Now, I know in the systems biology seminar I go to with Professor Dennis Noble, who's the father of systems biology, they're constantly telling us that it's not all bottom up. Even in the cell, there's top-down causation. And that, of course, is very gratifying to hear. But still, people make very, very serious errors with this. Recently, a book appeared by a biologist, Dennis Alexander, on the origin of life. And he says this, Imagine going into an artist's studio and then telling the artist you've chosen the wrong type of paints. They're really hopeless. I think we would all agree that would be insulting. But to confidently proclaim that the precious materials which God has brought into being in the dying moments of stars do not have the potentiality to bring about life seems to me equally insulting. Now that argument, ladies and gentlemen, is fatally flawed. The analogy does not correspond to the application. No one is suggesting that the Creator's materials are the wrong type or hopeless. What is being suggested by me and many others is that the Creator's good materials cannot bring life into existence without the additional direct intelligent input of the Creator. This is no more an insult to the Creator than it would be an insult to the artist to suggest that his paints are incapable of producing a masterpiece without his direct input. It is rather the ludicrous suggestion that the paints could do it on their own without him that would be an insult to the painter. And it is no more intellectual laziness to reject the idea that life is a product of the latent potential of matter and energy working according to the laws of nature than it is intellectually lazy to abandon the search for perpetual motion or to attribute a magnificent painting to the creative genius of Leonardo da Vinci rather than to the latent physical and chemical capacities of paint and canvas. Now what we're getting down to is this objection that many people feel very deeply, that God cannot move atoms. Listen to Paul Davies. The idea that God acts in fits and starts, moving atoms around on odd occasions in competition with natural forces, is a decidedly uninspiring image of the grand architect. However, the idea that the God who invented natural forces could be in competition with them sounds self-contradictory. What about the business of God moving atoms? Well, Leonardo da Vinci can help us. Neither the mind nor information is material. Yet the conceptual information in Leonardo's mind moved the atoms of the paintbrush, that moved the atoms of paint that produces masterpieces. None of those movements was in competition with natural forces. On the contrary, they involved those forces directed by a mind. And now we come to the heart of it. Of course, something immaterial can move atoms. Information is not material. And yet if I shouted fire, it would move the atoms in your body at a tremendous speed. And here's the irony, ladies and gentlemen. Naturalism has tried to crowd out the immaterial. And we've got to the information age, and information is not material. Isn't that ironical? And we're now faced with an assessment of the immaterial. Now, I want to make a couple more comments, if I may. It'll shorten the time for questions a little bit. But it seems to me to be so important that we get to this point, that human life is capable of reason. And all of our arguments in this conference are the use of the human mind to reason. Thomas Nagel makes the point that the reason that neo-Darwinism is almost certainly false is that we have failed to bring into bear, into focus, the reason that we use to do science. You see, the atheist position, I feel, is totally untenable because they hold that the driving force of evolution, which produced our cognitive faculties, was not concerned with truth at all, but with survival. And we all know, of course, what happens to truth when individuals or commercial entities, motivated by what Dawkins called their selfish genes, feel themselves threatened and struggle for survival. And the new atheists have signally failed to see the implications of their view. J.B.S. Haldane, the chemist, pointed out long ago, if the thoughts in my mind are just the motions of atoms in my brain, A mechanism that has arisen by mindless, unguided processes, why should I believe anything it tells me, including the fact it is made of atoms? John Gray, an atheist, writes, modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success and not truth. Now, Alvin Plantinga, who's well worth reading, his book Where the Problem Really Lies is a must-read. If Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. This is pretty impressive stuff. And ladies and gentlemen, the irony of my position is this: my chief objection to atheism is not because I'm a Christian, it's because I'm a scientist. Because atheism undermines the rationality that I need to do science. Of course, Christianity affirms it, which, as we saw in the rise of science. Now, the final thing to say is this: the Bible says relatively little about mechanism. Indeed, it says relatively little about the origin of the universe and life. I think if I'd been writing it, I'd have written a lot more, but then nobody would have understood it. God has given us what we need to know, but what he's given us is highly significant. There are two worldviews, ladies and gentlemen. One begins with mass energy in contemporary language, and everything else, life, consciousness, mind, is derivative. That's the one worldview. The other worldview is its exact opposite. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. The Word never came to be. The universe came to be. So mind, logos, God is primary, mass energy are derivative. This is not dual aspect monism for you philosophers. The primary stuff in the universe is spirit. God is spirit. Mass energy is derivative. We got it completely upside down. And Genesis 1 unpacks that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, and God said, and God said, and God said. And that sequence stops with Shabbat. We're so familiar with it that we often lose its vast significance, because it means if there is a sequence of creative inputs that stops, it means that the present is not a total key to the past. You cannot extrapolate from processes you observe going on now to what went on in the past, because, and notice this, 2 of the days of Genesis 1, God spoke more than once. I'm sure you've noticed that. On day 3 and day 6, almost as if the writer had anticipated the contemporary debate. On day 3, it's the difference between inorganic and life. And you don't get from one to the other without, and God said. There's an informational discontinuity. Day 6, it's the difference between animals and human beings. And God said. There's more to it, isn't there? By faith we understand that the worlds were made by the word of God, so that what is seen is not made out of that which is visible. How did they know that information was invisible? It's not only invisible, it's immaterial, isn't it? Hebrews 11 is worth having a little look at from this perspective. And so the Bible puts its finger on the central issue. It's the question not simply of the physical materials and their origin, but it's the question that as you build a world, there need to be informational inputs, which of course appear to us as discontinuities. Now, here's something I find very curious. Most people now believe in a discontinuity at the origin of space-time. Christians believe that there was a massive discontinuity 20 centuries ago called the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What is the a priori difficulty in believing there were a few more? You see, it's interesting, isn't it? Genesis says, and God said, just a few times, 5 or 6 times, that's all. What's the a priori difficulty of accepting there might be more, especially if the evidence is moving towards that? I've written a little book about that. It's called 7 Days That Divide the World on Genesis 1. But I must come to a stop. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to these magnificent words. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Life is a light. And in John 1, it's not talking about the incarnation yet, it's talking about creation. And John is making a profound comment that life is a light, all kinds of life. It's pointing somewhere. It's not neutral. And I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that because of that, if you try to explain life without God, you will inevitably end up in the dark. Thank you very much.
To view this program again and share it with your friends, and to learn more about this series, these conferences, and the intersection of science and faith, please go to www.pensmore.org.
The proceeding was brought to you by the Pensmore Foundation and NRB TV.